Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's meeting of the Fire Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee. Please may I remind all participants to turn your phones off or to put them on silent. And this morning I would like to start by taking a minute's silence, please, to express our sadness at the tragic murder of Sir David Amess, MP. I think you'll all appreciate just some of the work he's done by the amount of outpouring from all different regions. So if we can stand and do a minute's silence, please. Okay, thank you very much. So today we'll just start with apologies for absence. If I can ask our clerk, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies for absence have been received from Assembly Member Cooper, for whom Assembly Member McCartney will substitute today.
Thank you for substituting. We're grateful. We now return to today's business and our session on flooding, with a focus on London's resilience and the London Fire Brigade's preparedness. Members of the public may like to follow on at London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag AssemblyFire for this meeting. But we've got some short items of business first. Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? And can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests of any specific items listed on the agenda? No. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting on the 22nd of September 2021? Thank you. Can we note the completed and outstanding actions arising from previous meetings of the committee? Thank you. So that brings us to our main items of business, which is a discussion on flooding and London's resilience. So can I welcome our guests for this session? We've got quite a few guests. Thank you all so much for coming. I'll just introduce them to you all. Charlie Wood is the London Area Director for the Environment Agency. David O'Neill, MBE, is the Deputy Assistant Commissioner for the London Fire Brigade. Victoria Lawson, Chair of the LED-NET London Borough of Hounslow. John Hetherington is the Head of the London Resilience. And Patricia Curvo, Senior Flood and Water Management Officer, Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, and Co-Chair of the London Drainage Engineers Group. Welcome all. And joining us remotely, and I believe it's working well, so I'm pleased about that, is Alex Nixon, who is the Water Waste Systems Strategy Manager for Thames Water, and Lily Maston, Chief Safety, Health and Environment Officer for Transport for London. So, as you can see, we've got lots of expertise in the room today, for which we're very grateful. So I'll start the first question. And the question is, in what ways has the risk of flooding in London changed in recent years? What type of flooding has been identified as the highest risk in London? And I'll start that, if I may. I'll start with Charlie.
And thank you for inviting me here today. So there are a number of different sources of flooding in London. Surface water and fluvial flooding are assessed as very high risk, and groundwater and tidal flooding were assessed as high risk. And there are a number of reasons for this with regards to the city itself and the hard surfaces. And the fact that the ground itself gets overwhelmed and the combined sewer system. However, the tidal flood risk is well defended, as you know, we've got the Thames Barrier and all the associated defences along the river. And actually, the Thames Barrier is closing for the 200th time today and has protected Londoners, you know, since the 1980s. But surface water flooding is less well protected and less well understood. Because of the nature of, you know, the way that the risk is. So the fact that it's difficult to understand exactly locally how the interactions work, and very small changes can happen, which means that the risk, you know, can be diverted to a different place. So something, you know, as simple as a dropped curb can change where the risk might be. And obviously the risk from surface water is associated with where the rain falls, as opposed to coming out from the rivers or the tide. So I'll stop there and see if there are any further questions.
Okay. Many of us who are councillors understand and recognise that issue, and especially with people hard surfacing their front gardens has caused a risk going on. I'm looking around. Does anybody else have anything specific on that? Yes, Patricia.
Thank you very much. I would add to Charlie's. Thank you, Charlie. My input would be the importance of the fact that our sewer system in inner London is mainly combined. So the high risk of surface water increases the internal risk of sewer flooding, more so in lower floor areas, kind of basement areas and properties with lower floors, which historically we have quite a lot within central London, and the increase in basement development as well that we're seeing kind of exacerbates the issue. I would say that one of the issues that we have with surface water flood risk is the lack of a good forecasting and warning system, and as Charlie explained, the fact that surface water or storms can vary greatly within small geographical areas. So it's very difficult to warn and to forecast for those events. Yes, that's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. And to our guests on Zoom, do you have anything additional to add to that? Yes, it's Alex, isn't it? Yes. Alex.
Hello, good morning. Thank you. Alex Nixon from Thames Water here. Yes, I just wanted to agree with Patricia's point that we need to recognise sewer flooding as one of the types that London is vulnerable to. I would say sewer flooding is increasing as we see more development, driving more impermeable surfaces, more people digging down, developing their basements, turning what was formerly an uninhabitable space into an habitable space, or actually creating new basements. And just the fact that we've become oblivious to flood risk. I think Londoners have forgotten about flood risk, and we need to help them understand the risk they live at and help them become more resilient to that risk. Thank you.
Okay, in the next section we're going to be talking about the most recent flooding, because obviously Londoners are particularly interested in that, but it's interesting to know what you think is the main issues. We also need to hear about whose roles and responsibilities it is to deal with this. So if I can ask you, John, because you are the head of the London Resilience, which is where we're looking at for answers. How do London Resilience and its partners assess the risk and impact of flooding in London?
Thank you, Chair. So we have we follow national guidance in terms of our risk assessment. We have a comparator for all risks. There's around about 91 risks that are provided to us through the National Security Risk Assessment. And we go through a standard methodology of assessing the impact and likelihood over a 2-year period, so that we get that grid matrix that you may well have seen on the published risk register, but as Charlie spoke to, giving us the ratings of very high for the surface water and fluvial flooding and the high risks for tidal and groundwater flooding. Essentially, we go through a 6-step process. hazard identification and allocation, and in this case we use the Environment Agency as the lead assessor, and we have a working group of all Category 1 and most Category 2 responders who come together on a quarterly basis to work through those all of the risks. We then go through the risk analysis using government advice, local knowledge, and the lead assessor's expertise, and then the risk evaluation. So led by the Environment Agency, but agreed by the group. And then we're looking at the risk treatment, so where there is a specific capability needed, or whether or not we can cope with it within our generic plans. So the types of flooding that we have in London are covered by three major plans, if you like, as always the strategic coordination, so how we would coordinate amongst partners, and then more specifically we have a flood risk management plan, and we also have a severe weather plan. So the surface water flooding, for example, would be treated under the severe weather plan for London.
Because of course responding to different types of flooding must give its different issues. So what do you think are the key challenges to respond to different types of flooding in London? What are the main problems that you as a coordinator have?
So for the person who is suffering flooding, essentially they have water where they do not want it. And the difficulty of water is it will always find a route through. But the different types of flooding, like you say, do have different styles and different impacts. So the surface water comes quite often with very little notice, as Charlie referred to earlier. It doesn't follow a reasonable prediction in terms of mapping. It lies where the rain falls. It can be very subjective in terms of either a dropped curve, as we heard earlier, or as simple as leaves or a bin bag blocking a local drain can dramatically change the way in which that water is then flowing and going into the drains and sewers, as we heard. The fluvial tends to be slightly more predictable, but there are different river types in London. So last night with the flood warnings and flood alerts, we saw those in relation to the more flashier river catchment areas. So they have a much quicker response as opposed to the longer term response, which we would be able to plan for with better prediction. And then the tidal flooding, slightly more predictable, but I think a greater impact were the Thames barrier to be breached, or we were faced with a severe tidal flood, given the volume of water. And then the groundwater flooding, as we saw back in 2014 in the Kenley area and southeast London, it hangs around for an awful long time when the ground is saturated, and therefore further rain on top of further rain can kind of exacerbate that. So depending on the season, what the ground conditions are, how quickly the rain falls, all leads to very different types of flooding, and the response can be very different as well as to whether or not we can put in any pre-planned defences, whether or not we can divert flowing water, diverting or trying to barricade, if you like, through sandbags, standing water, groundwater, or surface water where it will find its way through. It is probably less effective. So that limits our response options.
Okay, if I can ask Alex from Thames Water, what are your key challenges in responding to the different types of flooding?
Sorry, Chair, if you just repeat the question, there was a bit of feedback on that.
Sorry. What are the key challenges in responding to different types of flooding in London, from your perspective?
Thank you very much. Heard you clearly that time. As John, stated, I think people don't differentiate between the type of flooding they're getting. They don't necessarily know where it's coming from, and therefore how to respond or who to call. And I think, as we saw in July, people ultimately called us and the excuse me, dogs. Homeworking, apologies, committee. As we saw in July, people didn't know who to call and ultimately called us, the fire brigade, and the London boroughs to try and work out what to do and would come to help them. So I think that's the key problem we've got. Also, as John enunciated, that people don't appreciate the risk that they live at, and therefore people may be unprepared for it, and even if they have experienced it once, because of the sort of the concept of a return period, many people think, having been flooded once, they are not going to be flooded again, and don't necessarily learn the lessons and take the preemptive actions they should do for the risks they live at.
Okay, I think you better go and rescue the postman, because it sounds like you're talking about him or her. Have you got anything, Charlie, to add to that from the Environment Agency point of view?
I'm just thinking what to add. I think most of the points have actually been covered.
That's fine. That's
fine. I would. Yeah, I suppose what we see is obviously across the whole country, and not to. The impact on mental health is a massive issue as well, that it's like a long-term impact that we mustn't forget about. So, not only, do we see that across the whole country, people are not aware of flooding, but also then the sort of recovering from it and the resilience to that is really tough on the individuals.
Yeah, and I think it shows how many of us, or how many of you, are involved when there are floods, and it is confusing for Londoners to know who to go to. So I'll put it out there, and if you indicate, in your experiences, is London equipped to cope with flood risk, including surface water flooding? How and why is it equipped? Who would like to take that on first? Now, you can't all shout at once. Charlie, do you want to just start?
Shall I cover the river and, so the Environment Agency has an overview for flooding from, main rivers and the sea. And I think from that point of view, we are well equipped. We have good defences in place. We have a good warning system in place. We are really well protected here from the sea and the tidal flooding. Fluvial flooding, as John mentioned, we have a number of catchments that respond rapidly, and we have a good alerts and warning system in place so that those communities know when that is coming, and we engage with them regularly so that they are aware. And also we have good plans in place to look forward to the changing climate and the impacts that we're going to see of increased rainfall, more extreme river levels, etc. So I think from those points of view, we're in a good place. From groundwater, we're aware of where those risks are. Again, we work with the communities and the local authorities to prepare people as best we can for that, and we keep we monitor the groundwater levels regularly so that we know as it's getting to a level that we know is high. I think surface water is a lot more complicated, as we've already sort of highlighted. And maybe I'll pass over to Patricia, and she can explain how it feels from her point of view, if that's okay.
Yes, if you think we're ready to cope. I mean, that's the question. Is London ready and equipped to cope?
From my point of view, I don't think we are equipped to cope, to be honest. And for two reasons. We are still differentiating between surface water and internal sewer flooding and the other type of flood risk that we can get. And we shouldn't really, to be honest. What we got on the 12th of July in my borough, in Kensington and Chelsea, is that a very intense storm event which changed in intensity from the north to the south tremendously. So we had an intensity of 1 in 100-year storm event in the north of the borough, and in the south we have 1 in 5. That coupled with the tidal flooding, the tide lock, increased the intensity of the storm event from 1 in 200 to 1 in 1,000 year event. That is something that we would expect in 1 in 1,000 years. So we got over 200 residents that we had to relocate, and a lot of internal sewer flooding.
So you don't think we are prepared?
I don't think. I think each LLFA, lead local flood authority, on their own responded well. Our colleagues from contingency planning. But I don't think we have a forecasting system and a warning system for surface water that is able to cope with the changes in intensity in a very small geographical area. And I think the fact that we are continuing to differentiate between different types of flood risk when actually we were impacted by surface water, by sewer water, by high tide on the 12th of July. Doesn't kind of help in that sense. And I also wanted to respond to the previous question, if I may, where you identify all the risk of flooding, but we didn't really talk about sewer flooding. And internal sewer flooding can happen when it's not obviously, when there is not a very intense storm happening outside your home. So if you have a basement and it's raining in some areas, it doesn't need to rain really intensely for the basement to be flooded internally. I'm not talking about external external surface water flooding. So we need to, I think from my point of view as a lead local flood authority, we need to stop thinking about different type of flood risk and face the reality that all those types of flood risk could interact and could increase the intensity and the consequences of the storm that we're facing at the time. So I think we need to improve to be able to address this type of flood
We're
risk.
going to talk about the recent events in the next section, but I take on board that you're not happy with that. Both colleagues on Zoom would like to come in. So Lily first, who is, of course, from Transport for London. So we've seen lots of flooding of stations, Lily. So what is your view? Are we equipped to deal with this?
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, everyone. So I think clearly the surface water flooding events that we've seen in recent months and just last night show just how challenging the changing climate is. And our view absolutely at the moment is, yes, we can run a safe transport network. And I think even if, I was tracking what happened last night and we are running the full transport network again this morning. So in terms of the practicalities of running and being resilient, yes, we are coping. But I think your inquiry comes at a really timely point, and that this is an absolutely huge issue for major asset owners like Transport for London looking forward. So if I look at where we need to do more to be prepared, it's in the area of collaboration. It's in the area of being really clear who needs to do what. And in the wake of the floods, the Mayor obviously set up a range of different task forces. And I think through those, we can make some really good progress in terms of enhancing that collaboration, and particularly around sharing of data, which was something that came up earlier. But it also focuses attention on the fact that for the transport network, it isn't just about being resilient to what will be increasingly frequent and increasingly more severe flooding events. It's about how we adapt our transport network into the future. And that means looking at the very way the infrastructure is designed. And for that, I think we have some real challenges, and the whole issue of future funding is a hugely important one and must be on the agenda to ensure that we can provide the right kind of assets for a city of 9 million that are safe, and that does require a really significant investment moving forward.
We're talking about funding in another section, so I'm sure we'll touch on that then. Alex, from Thames Water's point of view, are we ready and equipped to cope?
Thank you, Chair. I think we need to differentiate between different intensities of event. So clearly we cope very well most of the time. We regularly have intense convective summer storms coming over London, and it's quite rare for properties to be flooded. So at the moment, as Lily just mentioned, climate change is going to make those kinds of storms and other rainfall events more intense and more frequent in the future. And picking up Patrick's point, we need to provide an integrated, because we have a combined sewer. And also we have a number of boroughs that don't have any rivers to discharge their water to. So, we urgently need to work on a long-term solution to this. We believe that the July floods were a game changer, and we need to have that multi-agency collaboration, probably led by Thames, to drive that plan for London. And I think we need to recognise that when you have these really extreme events where you are greater than 1 in 100 years, covering large extensive areas, you cannot keep everything dry. You cannot build a big enough tunnel to take that away. And we need to look at a tiered multi-level resilience approach starting with the sewers, but then looking at the surface permeability, looking at the resilience of buildings and flood risk in order to come up with a better plan.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Very, very briefly, because I'm mindful of time, I'm just wondering whether the timing of any of these events cause additional problem, as in very heavy rain overnight. Does it make any difference? Can any of you say yes it does or no it doesn't? From the fire brigade's point of view, David, is it worse at night or?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, members. Well, anything that happens overnight, obviously more people are in their homes and alert to the event. So when we communicate with communities, it's easier for us to do that. Whereas during the day, people are out, people have been at work, they may not be aware of the impact that the event's having on their homes. So for us at night, the response capability is exactly the same as it is during the day, but we just change our focus from sort of warning and informing and evacuating, slightly easier during the day, and the issues we have communicating with people that may be returning from work to an event that's affected their property.
Okay. Charlie, did you want to come in?
Yeah,
briefly?
I mean, I suppose the main risk at night is the fact that people don't see the warning, in these, very intense rainfalls. They won't hear the rain, think about what the impacts might be, see the water coming in. So especially if they're asleep in a basement, where the water is rising. So, there is I suppose, a bigger risk to life of not being aware of what's happening around you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on now to the next questioning, which is from my colleague, Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, panel, both here and remotely. If I can begin with Charlie. So from an Environment Agency's perspective, is the expectation that because of a changing climate, flood risk is going to get worse and more severe? Or is there a prediction that because of changing adaptation, that could lessen? And what is your evidence for this?
Yes, so we do think it will get more severe, and as we were just discussing, we published an adaptation report last week, and our chair had some strong words, adapt or die. It is now that we need to act, and it is now that we need to adapt. So there are things that we can do to help improve the situation, but it needs to happen now. In London, it's about us all working collaboratively together, but it's also about big infrastructure providers making sure that they're resilient, understanding their risk and planning and building that in, and also from a the growth and housing market, making sure that they build in resilience, look at green and allow the trying to turn those hard surfaces into more kind of absorbing that water rather than it and slowing it entering into the sewer system. So there's a number of different things that come into play that can help.
Thank you very much, and I very much appreciated the strong words from the Environment Agency's report, Adapt or Die. Turning to John briefly from London Resilience, there's this talk of becoming a sponge city so that we can absorb the water. From your point of view, are you expecting flood risk to get more serious and severe, or do you think adaptation could mean that we could reduce it?
So firstly, I don't think we're ever going to stop flooding. It is a factor of life. I think the climate change evidence is there. If I look back through our individual risk assessment against surface water flooding, where we chart the history, I think I provided that in some of the briefing, but we went from instances in 1975 to 2002 to 2007, 16, and then 3 in 2021. It is clearly getting more significant. I think the strategy of preparing to enhance the response is probably the wrong one. We cannot respond our way out of this at the time of flooding. Adaptation will be the only way. So that is my hope at the very least.
Thank you. And then just returning briefly to Charlie once more before I finish. So there's a map that's often used by Climate Central, and it's we see it a lot in the media, particularly the Evening Standard. It's a map that exists if the Thames barrier didn't exist. Now, you've been doing work on your Thames Estuary Plan 2100, which I think is more comprehensive. Do you think there's a role for having better maps so people can see more clearly where their risk is?
There's always a role for better data and information, and we're working hard to continuously improve that. And I'm pretty sure that we've got a new version of the maps that we look at coming next year, which every time we do that, we are able to get to more detailed information. A lot of that, relies on the information that we get in, and working with the boroughs to refine the understanding of the risk and the impact. I think some of the issues that we see within the city is that there's so much growth that changes where the water will go and flow, and whether surfaces were porous and hard, and all those changes come into play. But the 2100 plan is about tidal flooding and having that adaptive pathways approach up until 2100, and taking in the evidence and the science that we know to take decisions, so that we can adapt based on what that evidence and science tells us. So we continuously update that, and we're actually in the 10-year review period, and what we've seen as we get into all that data is just more information is available, and we'll be able to understand things in a much better way. So, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think there's a risk, though, that if people are using maps that are out of date or exaggerate the risk but in the wrong place and underestimate the risk in the right place, then that can actually be damaging to public information?
I mean, absolutely, if you if you're reading the wrong information. However, I would say that it does make people stand up and think, am I at risk? And if then at least they go and look on the gov.uk website and find out they are at risk and understand it better, that can only be a good thing. It's just that if they obviously just read, the sort of wrong information, that's not necessarily helpful.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah. Assemblyman Rogers.
Thank you, Chair. David, I've got a few questions for you about London Fire Brigade. Do you have the equipment you need and the right level of resource to respond to the risk of flooding now and in the future in London?
I think the answer to that is yes at the moment. We conducted a flood enhancement project, was initiated in 2017, where we reviewed our flood response capability and the risk assessment based on rising statistical data. And that allowed us to purchase additional equipment, purchase additional training for our crews that are responding to anticipated events. To date, I'm pleased to say that we have been prepared. Even in the July events, at no point did we deplete our response capability. But this is something that we're constantly monitoring. So we're not resting there. It is right for the risk now, and we'll continue to review that risk and review our response and how we've used that new equipment and training to meet those demands.
The July events or any other recent events sort of throw up any gaps in equipment or training or resource?
No, the response, one of the key events at Whipps Cross Hospital, we had firefighters assisting in an evacuation, recovering medicines, that kind of thing. I think it gives us an opportunity to share our response procedures with partners who can see the kind of fairly cost-effective PPE, for example, that we have in place, and some of the freestanding barriers. And we always take the opportunity to encourage partners to gain a better understanding of our response capability so that they consider it for their own business continuity planning.
Thank you. The current London safety plan touches on this issue a bit, and in that plan it says that LFB is going to review the number of flood response teams. Have you done that, and if so, what was the result of that review?
So we have done that. We have 10 flood response teams that are frontline appliances. They're trained to a swiftwater rescue technician. They carry boats. They have access to floating pontoon systems so we can create walkways. We've also enhanced a number of out-of-area flood response teams that can support the rest of the country when London hasn't been affected, and they've been mobilised several times out of area, and they all conform to the DEFRA concept of operation, so it's a recognisable response standard.
Thank you. And also in this London Safety Plan, it says that you're going to be looking to extend the provision of PPE for floods to frontline crews. Do you have sufficient stock of that PPE?
Yes, we do. We've got 250 sets of a mixed range of sizes of that PPE, and we split that stock up, so we keep some north of London in Finchley and the remainder in the south at Croydon. And we've also made that PPE available for some partners, so it's very easy to don. And again, that's another example of how we can protect our own frontline crews and share basic experience with partners to perhaps showcase something that they could consider.
Thank you. And again, from the London Safety Plan, it says you'd be considering increasing the number of national flood advisors. Have you increased the number of these advisors?
Yes, we have. So the reason there's been a stall on the increase in national flood tactical advisors is because no courses have been run. So this is a DEFRA-sponsored course. We're lucky now that new courses have just been raised, and we've managed to secure 3 places on that course. So in early 22, we'll have 4 national flood TAC advisors, but our aspiration is still to have 12.
Thank you. Moving on, the LFB's been conducting a survey with Londoners towards developing the community risk management plan. To what extent was flooding highlighted by Londoners as a concern in that survey?
So the current community risk management plan consultation only finished last week. So the responses from that are being independently assessed, and at this stage I don't have that information. We haven't finished our assessment of the responses, but we'll continue to work with the committee to make that information available as we have it.
Could you, once it is available and once it's been assessed, could you write to us potentially through you, Chair? If that's
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you. So one final question from me. How will the risk of flooding be addressed in the community risk management plan?
Well, the community risk management plan looks at, with partners, looks at the risk that Londoners feel they face, major risks, of which flooding's one. As I said, we're quite comfortable with our response arrangements at the moment, and when we get that information, if there's anything for partners to be aware of that will assist them in the prevention of the event affecting Londoners, then we'll share that information.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And that brings us to our next section, which is surface water and flash flooding in London. And obviously we've had problems and issues. My colleague's going to take this, but I'm mindful that Victoria hasn't had her say yet. So if we could bear that in mind when asking questions, because everybody's views are important to us. So I'll hand over now to Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you. We've heard today from Patricia about the very localised issues with regards to surface water flooding and how there's a lack of forecasting ability. And Chair, at our recent Environment Committee, that point was made by Lily, actually, from Transport for London. And we have some evidence from the Met Office there, which might be helpful for this investigation too. But given that, is it actually possible to successfully plan and prepare for surface water flooding? I'm going to ask John to start off, perhaps.
So I think there was a study conducted in the late noughties around can there be an improved warning system looking at rainfall. The evidence showed that it wasn't statistically corroborative that where the rainfall was expected that it necessarily then led to flooding because of all of the areas that we've touched on before. And then in terms of the response, I think the question needs to be not are we as agencies prepared to respond, but are Londoners prepared? Because it's the small actions for them individually that will make the difference for their houses. So we're effectively on such a wide area, there is only a limited resource from the public services to help individuals. So they need to be able to understand what their risks are, understand what very simple steps they can take in terms of unplugging or looking at their electrical safety or moving kind of valuables upstairs or out of immediate risk. And that's really where the efforts need to focus in terms of the preparation.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to comment on that? Yes, Victoria.
Yeah, so just on your point about planning, so obviously as LFFAs, we do have statutory responsibilities around surface water, groundwater flooding. So there are flood risk management strategies, there are sort of local flood risk management plans, but of course you can plan. I think what Patricia and John have highlighted is then what is that response in quite a dispersed system, I think, for flood management.
Okay. So we can plan to a certain extent, but we perhaps can't predict exactly where the issue is going to be. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think on the day or night of the flooding, we can't be everywhere to support, and we won't stop the water moving through. So it's not like it's a flowing water that we can divert if it's coming out of bank with kind of barriers and try and keep it and channel it into a certain area. That the water is flooding, and groundwater and surface water are kind of unknown risks of it. It will come through the sewers and into houses or through air bricks or anything else. So the placebo sandbag isn't necessarily a useful response in those circumstances either. And we kind of face a death by 1,000 cuts of where do you even start to respond when there are so many. I think there's a further challenge, and we touched on it earlier, in terms of who does the public call, and therefore where do we know where is flooding. And there's another element, not only in the public agencies of who do they call, but also a lot of homeowners will not want the association with flooding of their properties for the insurance purposes. And until we kind of tackle that, then we will never get the full indication of where people have flooded.
So Alex would also like to come in. He's on the screen from Thames Water.
Yes, Alex.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, as you may be aware, we've appointed an independent review to look into the July storms, partly to understand, were our assets complicit or in increasing the flood risk, but also to look at what is the potential long-term solution for London. One of the members of the independent review is a lady named Localized, who works for Copenhagen City, and she was responsible for leading the development of their what's called cloudburst management plan, because they experienced a 1 in 1,000 and a 1 in 400 year storms in consecutive years in 2010, 2011, and they are planning and delivering a strategy to climate-proof the city for up to a 1 in 100 year plus climate change surface water management plan. And so we're very interested to learn from her. She also chairs an international best practice group of cities to see, what is the state of the art and how we can do that. Can we ever stop flooding? As John said, no. Can we make sure that the worst impacts are managed? Yes, but only through intense and persistent collaboration.
Thank you. Yes, Patricia.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to Charlie's point about evidence and information, and that information is available out there for everyone to see. We don't have a very, very good forecasting system for surface water. However, we could probably say that most of central London would be a risk, some kind of risk of surface water. So it is how we give this message to everyone, how we allow people to first understand the risk and then be prepared for the risk as John was saying. Is it that difficult to have a plan, a flooding plan for each household? And also we need to be careful when we explain the risks to people, not to cause panic. Given the last experience that we have with the petrol. So it is very important that we give people the right information and that they take that information in and they get prepared and they have the right insurance in place, and they are aware of the flood risk that they are likely to suffer from.
Thank you. And then moving on to my next question, what is thinking about this summer in particular, and the recent flash flooding that we've had, what assessment has been made about the impact of those recent events, and perhaps what was the biggest impact? And perhaps I'm going to start with John again, but I'd be interested in TfL and also perhaps the fire brigade and local authorities. Yeah.
So in terms of the impacts, I think it's probably better to hand to the local authorities who conduct the longer term follow-up. But that, I stress that is that longer term follow-up. We have undertaken a partnership debrief. We've looked at a number of themed areas of lessons. We've looked at key areas around the weather warnings, notification and activation, and then how we instigate the partnership quickly in terms of trying to understand that impact assessment and what data we have available at the time. So that's our kind of work to be done to date. The round tables that we've mentioned have been extremely useful. They've brought political support, they've brought focus, and they've brought people together to look at the roles and responsibilities and some of those kind of early quick wins and force the pace on our adaptation and realisation of this. So I think now more than ever that I've been in this role in LFB over the last 11 years, I've seen quite a kind of acceleration and kind of clear support behind these issues.
Thank you. Victoria, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there were probably a range of different impacts depending on which part of London you were in, and I think there's been quite a significant debrief that's been led by London Resilience Group. But Mayor Glanville, who's the chair of the Transport and Environment Committee representing London councils, and they've now put in place the Surface Water Task and Finish Group, and I think, Charlotte, you're on that as sort of co-chair, and I think they're starting to look at some of the issues in response to that around governance, funding, and in particular communications, which I think has come up several times. And the plan is that set of recommendations will go to the Tech Executive in February of next year.
And from a TfL point of view, Lily, would you like to say what was the biggest impact?
Yeah, thank you. So clearly, both the flooding events in July had a significant impact on both the public transport and the road network. We saw extensive station closures on the London Underground and a number of main road locations, such as Charlie Brown's Roundabout, which again was flooded for part of the evening last night. So real disruption to our customers. Thankfully, those were pretty quickly addressed. But I think the longer term impacts of continued events like this is potentially to impact on customer confidence. Through the measures that were put in place, and we, at some point, if you want, I'm happy to detail the operational sort of response measures we have, because we have a very clear and detailed response to handling these kind of incidents. There were no safety events, but in the longer term, obviously, people can be wary and disgruntled by ongoing disruption to their transport network. So we have really focused internally, both through those wider collaborative meetings that we've talked about, such as the Surface Water Task and Finish Group, but also internally undertaking a pan-TfL review. And some of the learnings have been quite short-term in terms of improved PPE, or redeployment of our contractor resources so that we have more gully suckers or pumps available where we need it. But there will be longer term learnings from that review as well, in terms of how we make our assets more resilient and how we have and improve our information in terms of where we really need to strengthen our infrastructure and our overall asset base.
Thank you. I think there'll be some further questions on that a little later, but can I just turn to the London Fire Brigade as well? What was the biggest impact on you?
I think that certainly the 12th of July incident tested our resilience, particularly in our control centre, and it gave us the opportunity, I suppose, to practice our own contingency arrangements on how, for example, calls are diverted. Over that period, it was the highest number of calls that we received on record ever. So calls were diverted to other control centres. We were able to practice our recall arrangements to bring additional call handlers into our control centre. Then in the response phase as well. I think the response phase worked quite well, but the major incident protocol and sharing of information between partners again worked well. So I think the lessons for us really was exercising our resilience arrangements in our control centre, but also exercising our coordination centre that looks internally at the impact on our own infrastructure and our ability to meet our statutory duty whilst we've got so many assets dealing with an incident. And that could be the availability of fire stations, staff coming onto those stations. So it was for us, it was an opportunity for us to exercise contingency arrangements for real.
Thank you. Chair, I think my next question's more or less been covered, and they will be covered in later questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'll now go on to Assembly Member Sahota.
Thank you, Chair. This is a question for you, John. What's your assessment and how you rate the effectiveness of the response to the recent surface water floods in London? I mean, how well do you think we handled it?
So that's a very difficult answer to provide. There's no litmus test of whether this was success or failure. For those whose houses flooded, they will feel that is a horrendous result in their own home. Overall, if we judge it against other large-scale incidents, then the casualties or anything else such like was far diminished. Our preparations are to enable us to respond collectively rather than respond to specific things. So when we think of the flood response, we want to respond at the lowest possible level, but coordinate at the most appropriate level. And what we don't want to do, or perhaps it is wrong to base that at the London level right from the outset. So this is about individual agencies, those that own the assets, and the kind of the local flood management plans, where the expertise, the understanding and the knowledge and that human touch into the public that they serve is best placed. And then where we are poised as London Resilience, it is where we declare a major incident or an agency cannot cope and have to implement specific measures, then we can support the larger coordination against a specific issue. Our response is very much based on assessing the information, sharing that information with partners, making sure that they are aware, which we performed. There's always room for improvement, so hence why we debrief quickly and we kind of include our other responses. So, for instance, last night we knew that the professional partner line wasn't well known by other partners in the previous responses. We took Thames Water, dialed into the teleconference at 10 o'clock last night, and we shared that line just for people's awarenesses. So we're always looking at making just the small improvements that can make quite a difference.
So, I mean, what happened? I mean, what was the sequence of events that happened when the flooding happened, say last July? Okay, what was your role in it as an organisation? What were you doing?
So we, like all the other Category 1 responders, receive the alerts direct from the Met Office. If we take one of the events to the 12th of July, for example, the assessment came in. We get quite a limited amount of information. So that comes from the Met Office, okay. Providing their outlook on what they're expecting to see. So I can give you an example of what it is we're going with in terms of the assessment we got was, although there's a few bright and sunny spells, it's generally rather cloudy this morning with outbreaks of rain in places, but showers locally heavy with thunderstorms are expected to develop this afternoon. Showers could be fairly slow moving and give some torrential downpours in places during this afternoon. We could see as much as 20 to 30 millimetres of rain in an hour and 60 millimetres in the space of 2 to 3 hours. As with any showery situation, it's not possible to say where the heaviest showers will fall. There is a low risk that we could see some more widespread heavy rain. We're ranking this as a yellow rain warning, low likelihood of medium impacts. So from that, we've then got to ascertain what does that mean. We can use a number of different tools such as Hazard Manager, different forecasts, but ultimately we will get in touch with the Met Office advisor for London, have a conversation with them, then we'll extend that out and have a conversation with the Environment Agency as well, which we we term the Tripartite call, and between their professional assessments, we will work out whether there is a need for kind of further partnership collaboration. On the 12th, it was deemed that there wasn't sufficient evidence at that stage to provide a kind of credible threat at that time. It was a yellow warning, so it was a yellow warning in the wrong place of the grid. So all it had to change was its likelihood, and the impact was quite severe, the medium impact. And then once we started to see the call volumes coming in from London Fire Brigade, due to our hosted nature within London Fire Brigade, we were part of that management discussion that looked at the pressures on the control room and the need to declare that incident as a major incident, as a demonstration to other partners that London Fire Brigade is putting in special arrangements to deal with this. We then invoked a partnership teleconference at 8 o'clock that night to bring together partners and work out quite what the assessment is, what people are doing, and is there any further actions and coordination that needs to take place across agencies.
So thank you very much for explaining that of your role as coordinating. And so, on reflecting, I mean, how well do you think we coped? I mean, do you think the agencies responded well? What lessons did you learn from all this, of the incident on the 12th?
So we've re-looked at the weather warnings, as we've said. We've tightened up, so we now our trigger was always an amber weather warning. That's when there's a greater risk to life and property. We've brought that down to a yellow warning, so there's greater assessment and scrutiny on that. Typically, I think, as I mentioned earlier, our role as a coordinator is for an agency to flag that they have an issue. So that's the declaration of a major incident would then invoke the need for further coordination. Where we are creeping too slowly is that because, and as I mentioned earlier, the kind of, I know it's a bad analogy, but a death by 1,000 cuts, with there's so many small pockets of issues occurring all over the place. London doesn't have an all-seeing eye. The impact assessment of what is going on and what the impact on the streets from one street to the other is extremely difficult. So trying to gather that picture, and then the other complication, surface water, previously known as kind of flash flooding. We know that it will most likely, based on the assessments, weather forecasting assessments, finish and recede quite quickly after it has happened. So there isn't a huge time span within which to coordinate. So,
I mean, your role is one of coordination, okay?
Yeah.
And you call upon other partners to respond. Your assessment, did they respond appropriately? I mean, what were the lessons you learned from it? I'm not getting a sense of that. What lessons did the services respond appropriately to the challenges faced us on that evening? And what could we have done better?
So yes, all the partners did respond. Where LFB were called, they changed their operating procedures. They were able to support the public. Local authorities in Westminster opened rest centres and looked after the vulnerable kind of residents, and where people were evacuated from their homes if they needed to be, or kind of left their homes with their own options, and they did leave. There are always improvements that we can make, so we've recognised that public communications should be improved. But I'll go back to the statement I made earlier. We should not be preparing and putting all of our eggs in the response. This is about how we adapt, how we kind of mitigate all of the impacts, and how we warn and inform the public before it happens, so that they are better prepared to take the individual actions, because they are so low level that the actions that they can take that will make a difference for them, as opposed to the public services coming in and supporting them once it has happened.
Thank you. And the question for David. At what point does the London Fire Brigade declare major incidents in surface water flooding situations? And what does this mean to you? And how does your response change once you declare a major incident, as opposed to when it isn't a major incident?
So the live example of the July flooding, where we declared a major incident, it was because we had to invoke specific additional response arrangements. So that was to do with our control centre and not to do with the response side of the incident. So it was declared a major incident because special arrangements have been put in place, and that was the recall of staff, the diverting of calls to other control centres around the country. And that's a way for us to alert partners to the fact that the London Fire Brigade response has in some way been compromised, or special arrangements have had to be brought in. So it's a way of informing other partners that we are sort of outside of business as usual. So I think it's important to stress that the declaration was not for the response and the event itself, but the arrangements put in place for our control centre.
But I mean, what triggered you to call it? Was it the number of calls you were getting from members of the public?
It was a number of calls. So at its peak, our control centre received 1,430 individual calls coming in between 5 and 9 o'clock. And over that 24-hour period, we received 3,000 calls coming into the control centre.
So for you, the number of calls, right,
Yes.
was what was making you think this is a major incident,
Yes.
rather than any other source of information? It was just the public.
It was literally the number of calls that were coming in, and it wasn't just for the flood. The calls were coming in for, the normal calls that we would get anyway. And of course, the flood does impact other events around London. That could be fire, could be traffic accidents because of the flooding. So that was the reason for the declaration.
Good. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. I know I was at Merton with the Deputy Mayor for Fire very shortly after that, and there was great concern because of the complexities of the phone calls coming through. It was a very difficult time for many Londoners. I'll go on now to questioning from Assembly Member Rogers.
Chair, a question for Lily from Transport for London. You've touched on the impact of the July events on the transport network, and you mentioned your operational response procedures. So I just wondered if you'd be able to elaborate in a bit more detail about how you respond during a flooding event.
Yeah, thank you very much. And this is relevant also to the questions that were just asked, in fact. So we obviously run a 24-hour control centres within Transport for London to observe both the road network and the public transport network. And we have sort of severe weather contingency plans in place that start as long as 5 days in advance of any event. And then we track down day by day with the contingent measures being put in place. So, for example, in advance of the July flooding events, where we had the information from the Meteorological Office, we were able to deploy mitigating actions to any locations where we knew, for example, there might be faults with pumps or sumps, and to put as far as we can with something that is as unexpected as surface water flooding, contingency measures such as our contractors with gully suckers on standby and ready to take action. When in the actual event of the rainfall happening or an emergent, a major incident being called, we have a particular command structure that is stood up within those control centres, which allows us, using our CCTV networks, to deploy resources to those locations. So, for example, that might be on the road network, our contractors going out with advanced gully suckers to try to clear any flooding or blockages, or to, if we deem that the road is unsafe, to cone it off and make sure that there isn't any traffic travelling down it. On the rail network, or the underground network in particular, we also have our emergency response unit, which is a very special team of individuals whose sole job is to respond to emergencies of many different types, but including flooding. And they will go to stations or locations and put in place barriers and get in place pumps to address the situation. So as far as possible, we can be agile and deploy these resources around the network to, first and foremost, our overriding priority is to preserve safety, so to make sure that we are protecting people, and then as much as possible to get the network stood back up and running as quickly as possible. In parallel and around that, we use our social media communications and all forms of communications that we have with over 4 million Londoners to inform them through our networks in terms of the disruption to the network, and ideally to get them to reroute their travel or not to travel if we feel it's unsafe. And again, with the aim of keeping them safe as well as minimising their disruption.
So, and is there sort of a post-incident review where you look at the actions you took and lessons learned, and what kind of lessons have you learned from the July event?
Yes, absolutely. So there's been special reviews on all aspects of our transport network, both on the surface, so the road network side, and on the public transport side. And as I mentioned earlier, we're bringing this together into one pan-TfL review. But just to highlight some of the learnings that we've identified. So, for example, on the road network, we identified that we should be looking to ask our highways contractors to have more gully suckers available and in advanced locations ready to go as far as possible where we knew there were likely to be trouble spots. On the public transport network, some of the lessons were quite simple. Some of our station staff didn't have appropriate PPE to be cleaning up floodwater, which was likely to be contaminated with human feces. So that there sometimes the lessons are quite simple and sometimes they're more fundamental. I think the fundamental learnings are also to look a little bit more widely. While this was happening in London, we also saw some very extreme weather events happening in China and mainland Europe. And actually, it's those kind of learnings as well, which are informing some of our longer term planning, just about how extreme weather really can be devastating to assets. So there's a broader piece of thinking going on about this within TfL right now.
Thank you. Actually, I might just ask Victoria. It's obviously not just the Transport for London road network that was affected. The borough road networks were massively impacted as well. What kind of responses are the boroughs making to this? What kind of lessons have they learned as well from the July events?
That's a very good question. So again, I think there's been quite an extensive debrief supported by London Resilience about the different boroughs that were impacted, because I think it varied depending on which part of London you were in. Patrice might be able to add a little more, but we're now also undertaking our Section 19 reports as well, just to understand the impact. Obviously, that's part of our statutory duties, but that's just to investigate each of the flood events and impacts for each of the individual boroughs. I don't know, Patricia, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Just
we were doing them.
Apart from the fact that we're doing our Section 19 investigations, our colleagues within the Highways Department in each local authority do maintain their assets and do make sure that the gullies are clean and properly maintained. And I can only talk about Kensington and Chelsea because I don't know about the rest of the boroughs, but I know that we did maintain it, and in some streets they just had the cleaning the day before. So the importance of maintenance of any asset, really, not just our assets as a local authority, is tremendous for this type of events.
Moving on, a question for John. How is the London Resilience Partnership working with London's NHS trusts to reduce the risk of hospitals flooding and prevent the closure of hospitals as a result of flooding?
So the NHS are one of our key partners, and we work with them on all aspects of resilience planning. In terms of the protection for their individual specific trusts, they're the asset owner, so it's their responsibility in terms of looking at the individual impact and what further mitigations that they need to put in place. So going back to the Civil Contingencies Act, there is a duty for emergency plans and a duty to collaborate and coordinate where there is a multi-agency aspect of that. But one of the other key aspects is business continuity, which is the duty upon all of the Category 1 responders to maintain their services in the face of the risks that we present through the London Risk Register. And so that process for the NHS Trust building their emergency plans, that's collaborative, and you work with them on that, do you? Absolutely, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Another question for Victoria. Touched on the transport aspect of this. What would you say has been the main challenge for London's local authorities responding to flooding, and what further support do you think you need?
I think we've covered some of the main issues, but I think in summary, I think it's the prediction of the intensity of the rainfall, therefore then our ability to, with partners, to warn and inform. I think that's part of it, and then obviously the ability to get the communications out. I think we've talked about the coordination of communications for the future, and then of course thinking slightly longer term, just about that funding into infrastructure investment. Most London boroughs have declared a climate emergency. All but one of those have now produced a climate emergency action plan. They all but one include something about being adaptation and resilience, including flooding. So there is that sort of longer term perspective that are being taken by London boroughs. But inevitably there'll always be questions about prioritisation around funding and where we apply that and where we don't. In Hounslow, we're extremely lucky. We're in a strategic partnership with Thames Water, so we're able to look at things like SUDS more extensively than perhaps others. We're really keen to share that learning. We're just into the first year of that programme, but we think that could be quite successful. I think Lambeth are the other London borough that are part of that partnership, and that's just an identification for us as a London borough about the pressure that we have on our drainage system.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Assembly Member Polanski wants to come in on the TfL aspect, I think.
Exactly, it's a question for Lily. Lily, in the chamber earlier, both Charlie answered questions to myself and colleagues and Patricia by talking about the importance of data. And Victoria just talked about warning and informing. Now, my office has found out that 141 hours of tube station closures happened this year, and that was data up until last month, so I'm presuming it's much higher now. This information has been quite hard to obtain, though. Would you commit to publishing regularly accessible and transparent data about impacts on Londoners on the tube network?
Well, I would certainly agree that data and access to data is absolutely critical for getting this whole response right. So one of the problems that we may have currently is that we may not have all of that information to hand. So while I'd like to commit to being as open about that as possible, the issue for us is sometimes it is quite hard to get hold of all of that data. So whatever we can share, we're happy to do so. But it brings me on to a wider point, which is that we need to improve, well, as a city, but within TfL in particular, how some of the data on recording incidents is undertaken and how we really understand the impacts of those incidents. That's critical so that we can improve our response, improve the information that you get as the public, but also so that we can better inform the decisions and the priority that we give to addressing the issues such as adaptation and resilience of our stations. So it's not to duck the question, but really to acknowledge that actually there is a big need to improve our whole data and understanding of this. And we need some support from that, from other agencies from that, but also in terms of funding to enable us to do so.
Thanks for your clarification, Lily, and I'll be brief because I'm aware of the chair of time. But what I'm hearing there is a commitment to incomplete information, which I'm fine with, because at the moment, to even get that incomplete information, we have to submit a written question, and it's very difficult for the Assembly to track progress on floods and how TfL are doing, which is also, the job of this committee and the Environment Committee. So is that a commitment to publish information, even if it's not perfect, at least regularly, and make it transparent?
So I totally commit to improving our systems and to make available what we can. What I think the issue will be for you is that at the moment that might not be the full picture, and indeed that's an issue for us as well. So I'm quite happy to take that away and to provide in writing as much as we can, really, in a genuine effort to be helpful.
Thanks, I really appreciate that. Thank you, Chair.
I'm sure we all appreciate it. We cannot do our jobs properly, any of us, without the correct information. So we look forward to hearing from you. The next questions, please, from Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you, Chair. And just to come off on the previous question about the local authorities, can I just ask a quick question to TfL, please? Where councils may have a challenge of mitigating against flood risk, is TfL going to be taking any steps to manage highway space to deliver flood mitigation? And considering there's been a report from the London Strategic SUDS pilot study about the importance of repurposing highways and public realm space for SUDS, have you had any assurances of maybe even getting some funding from the Department of Transport to invest in resilience and for needed mitigation against severe flood events?
So I'll come on to the funding aspect of that question. More generally, obviously, Transport for London manages 5% of the road network within London. The the strategic road network, and we work very closely with borough partners around the remaining 95%. We have an ambition, it's more than ambition, it's a target within the Mayor's transport strategy to increase the amount of sustainable urban drainage in London. I think it's by 50,000 metres square a year, or I'm not quite sure if it's exactly right, but I'll clarify that. But it is a target, and we're working very hard to achieve that. The point of sustainable urban drainage, and that includes tree planting on our own network, greenery, working with boroughs to improve their green drainage areas, is that then slows and reduces the amount of rain running onto the road network and the flooding that results from that. That is work in progress, and it is rolling forward. We haven't had specific discussions on that exact point with the Department of Transport. We're subject to wider discussions about our overall level of funding with the department, and maintaining safe assets is absolutely the core of those discussions. So within that broader discussion about how we maintain a resilient asset base for London, yes, we are discussing funding with the government, but not on the specific point with regard to sustainable urban drainage per se. I hope that helps answer some of your points.
Thank you. Yeah, it would be great to see you working better with councils that are struggling at the moment, who need that kind of support as well. Moving on to Thames Water, Alex, what measures have you put in place to increase your capacity to handle calls regarding flooding? And I know you've mentioned in the last Environment Committee that you were putting investment into this, because that is a major issue when people are calling you at quite when flooding is happening in London, it's quick and it's worrying and for residents, and they may be calling the wrong people, they may not be getting the right information. But one of the things that was concerning me was some residents were saying that Thames Water were actually admitting to even having wrong data and numbers that weren't quite correct for councils. Is that still an issue?
So just to respond to your first point on what we did, we experienced about 4,000 calls on the 12th of July compared to our sort of normal expectation of 2,000 calls. So we did struggle to answer the phone. And large numbers of customers were kept waiting for way too long, which led to a high call abandonment rate. So we apologise to all of those customers. What have we done about it? Well, what we've done is we've trained people in our sort of retail bill centre to be able to take emergency calls on flooding. So we've got 20% increase in emergency capacity there. We've improved our website to make sure that there is more information online about what to do before, during and after a flood. We've made it easier to find on our website, and we've also played with the search engine optimization. So when you search for flooding Thames, you don't end up with 60 drainage contractors before you get to our website. Our website is right in the top 3. We've improved our call waiting messaging. So when people are trying to get through to us, we're actually giving them advice they can act on rather than something that is just frustrating. And we are working with how we can increase the size of the team and the flexibility of the team, so we can not only have more people in the call centre, but also when we need to ask people to extend shifts because of a surge in demand, we have that flexibility. All of these are interim measures while we also look at investing in a new telephony system, so we have that greater flexibility physically as well as the people to answer the phone. I'd say also we need to do is develop a more sort of a smarter contact process. So exactly as Lily was outlining that TfL do, is use your social media contacts and channels to be able to convey information out to people and to explain to them, are we the best people to be calling? Who else should they be contacting? What could they be doing? So the customers aren't just left hanging on a phone call. They have information they can act upon.
Thank you. And on to John from London Resilience. What factors made it difficult to gather a picture of the extent and the nature of the flooding that took place in London in July? And how are these issues being addressed?
Thank you. So I think we've covered a number of those already, but just to reiterate what we're effectively trying to do is pull together a jigsaw where the picture is changing and the shape of all of the pieces is changing, and we only have a few of those pieces. So trying to understand what is going on across London is extremely difficult. I kind of gave the example of what the weather forecast provides earlier. We've got to take into account the time, the duration of the rain, the wind, as was a factor last night. So whilst it was a yellow warning all the way through the day, and following 2 calls with the Met Office advisor for London, where they were fairly confident that it would be a low level and not create problems in terms of surface water flooding. At 8:30 at night, that suddenly changes because the wind totally stopped and the highest intensity was falling on London. So there's a multitude of different things that are going on, what the current surface conditions are, what the tides, as we heard earlier, whether that's going to lock the sewers, whether there are any specific local blockages or just kind of ill repairs to houses. So last night, looking at some of the systems and some of the fire brigade calls, I was quite surprised to see a call came in from a 3rd floor flat, but obviously they have problems with the roofing or something else. So we never quite know where the water is going to go, but we know that water will find its own course to where we don't want it to go, pretty much. So our weather warnings are good, but they're probably more frequent than you would expect. So it is not a case that upon the receipt of the weather warning, we know there is going to be a problem. Over the period 12th to the 25th of July, I think from memory we had at least 4, if not 5, similar style weather warnings, but only 2 instances of surface water flooding. So we're constantly trying to assess different pictures. And then coupled to that, my staff are remote working the majority of the time. A call at 8:20 or 8:30, or even it was an email and a text that comes in, they've got to be alert to notice that, to then respond. And some of us live outside of London, so the climatic conditions are very different when you're looking outside of your window trying to comprehend what the impact is. So we don't have a centralised control room in London where all of the agencies generally work. TfL are in Palestra, London Fire Brigade in Merton, Met Police in Lambeth, other agencies all over the place. So we're very quickly trying to pull together all of this information and kind of work out what the picture is. Since July, we've realised that there is some data that we can use. So whether or not we get hold of LFB's current call mapping that the data analysts can produce relatively quickly. Likewise, Thames Water are looking at what kind of call mapping and how they can translate that into a GIS tool to come over. But as I said earlier, the response time of surface water flooding is quite short. So last night, the warning came in at 8:30 that it would be in effect and impacts coming from 9 o'clock. And that ran through till 1 o'clock in the morning. So a 4-hour window to assess, alert partners, get them to provide impacts, and then do something about it doesn't actually give us a long time in terms of what we're trying to coordinate.
Very much.
Thank you. And the next question is from Assembly Member Ahmad.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, panel. We've heard the phrase working collaboratively this morning, and my questions are about how you work together and what can be improved. So my first questions are is to Charlie and John. What action is being taken to ensure a more proactive stance on tripartite calls between the Met Office, the Environment Agency and the London Resilience Group? So Charlie, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, so as John mentioned, actually last night is a good example of where we had that call at 10 o'clock, I think it was, and we, I think previously wouldn't necessarily have done that. So, we're making sure that we now proactively have that call and have that discussion. Also, the other thing that became apparent after the previous flooding in July is, does everybody really understand the data and information that's coming in about the weather warning versus the flood guidance statement? So we're going to do some training jointly with the Met Office on that, so that is better understood up front, so that you know what you're getting when it comes through. And it's something that we do regularly, but maybe what we've realised is, the pandemic's been our focus, and there's been changeover in staff, and it's a good time to revisit that. Anything else that you wanted to come in on?
I think we've also renewed efforts. So I've described a number of different categorisations of flood warnings. So we have a yellow flood warning, an amber flood warning, where we have the defined trigger to kind of instigate partnership coordination. Where we used to have a tripartite call, so our duty officer, the Environment Agency and the Met Office at the amber warning, we've now lessened that, so it comes in on a yellow warning. So throughout the course of yesterday, when we received the first warning, in the morning, my duty officer made a call around about 11:15 with the Met Office to understand the kind of complexities and the nuances of the forecast given. We then touched base again at 4:30, although it hadn't changed. We thought that was an opportune time just to make sure before kind of organisations stop their kind of business hour operations, and then as soon as we got the further call or alert and the change in the alert at 8:30, we instigated a further call, which then prompted a wider partners call at 10 o'clock at night.
Thank you. My next question is for Patricia, Victoria and Alex. What were the main difficulties identified in fast time communication between Thames Water, LLFAs and other partners, and if there are issues, what action is being taken to resolve those issues? Yes, please.
Yeah, I think on the day of the event, there was Thames Water was probably communicating with our colleagues in contingency planning and in highways, but they weren't communicating with me, and I as the LLFA was providing all the information that I could to my senior manager, to my councillors, to the local MP on the reasons of the flooding, on what was happening. So I think that was a shortcoming, but as Alex said, we are trying to improve communications in that way at the moment. I don't know if Alex wants to respond to me on that.
Alex, would you like to go next?
Thank you. Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of what Patricia is saying. I think that, as John outlined, there was a slow rising anguish of pain across London that we were all slow to recognise, Thames especially. We didn't see an incident happening. All our gauges and all our telemetry of our assets were telling us that things were working fine. We weren't getting calls in from emergency planners to say that there was something wrong, and therefore I think we were slow in recognising that there was a rising incident, and I think that we've subsequently worked through the London Resilience and with partners to identify how we need to review those triggers to be able to stand up that incident and to be better in the preemptive communication. So when we have that yellow weather warning, we're putting the calls in, we are better prepared, and ultimately it's led to us developing what we call an operational playbook for heavy rain. So we now have a very well-defined process when we have these yellow heavy rainfall forecasts of how we liaise with people external to ourselves and how we internally liaise and make sure that we are all ready for those kinds of potential impacts. I did want to make a note in response to John's very important point, in that there have been 70 yellow weather warnings this year. That's nearly 2 a week. And if we went to full emergency response every time a yellow weather warning came up, it would really hamper all of these partners' ability to do their day jobs and to deliver important investment upgrades. So we need to find that right balance between being prepared, ready to go, but not actually interrupting what we do, because then we can't get on with the important day job.
Thank you, Victoria.
Yeah, just to add to that, so I think there were a number of issues around communications. Obviously, we talked about Thames Water and the boroughs, but I also think there's been quite a lot of work that's been happening with communications officers right across London. So obviously boroughs have the responsibility to warn and inform, but if we need a more collective response, then London Council's communications team step in with London Resilience. Now, I know their director of communications at London Councils has been talking to the LFB, the GLA and others to discuss the outcomes from the roundtables. And then they've also started to look at, okay, well, how can we make improvements to that coordination of communications? And I think that's really important. And they've also taken soundings from some of the directors in the most affected boroughs. So they've spoken to Hammersmith and Fulham, Westminster and Newham to just understand what that felt like on the ground as well, to inform the changes that we want to make to coordination around comms.
Thank you. My next question is to John. How will London Resilience work with key partners to ensure enhanced partnership coordination is established on all amber weather warnings, and what does that actually mean in practice?
So I think, like I said earlier, last night was a case example where the alert moved from a yellow warning to an amber warning, and it's based on a coloured grid, a matrix, a 4x4 grid of where it sits in terms of likelihood and impact. So where we're very nervous is the kind of low likelihood of high impacts, because that can change on a sixpence really with the change in the wind or the duration or the intensity of rain. And we've heightened our awareness. We follow up on the yellow warnings far more. We take a nuance, and I think the figures that Alex gave in terms of the 70 weather warnings, my staff have been on the Met Office weather warning training for half a day, but they are not meteorologists, and that sits against the other 80 incidents that we respond to for all the different other hazards and responding to on top of their job, which is to plan and prepare for emergencies as well. So this takes a limited amount of their headspace, as it were, but that's why we've now moved to a much more quicker response. We'll interrogate the yellow warnings more, and we'll definitely invoke a partnership call on an amber warning.
Thank you. At the recent flooding roundtable convened by the Mayor, several issues were revealed relating to a lack of clarity on governance, liability and responsibility for surface water flooding in London. For example, there's no single overall responsible authority in practice identified to provide the strategic leadership that's needed in London, nor is there a single authority tasked with preparing a London-wide strategic plan to manage surface water flooding and to drive the delivery of measures needed to keep Londoners safe. Chair, I'm going to ask your indulgence on this and ask all the panel for a brief answer to this, because I think it's very important. Do we need a single authority to deal with surface water flooding in London? And John, you actually said earlier London doesn't have an all-seeing eye, which I wondered did allude to this. I wonder if we could start with you.
So my all-seeing eye comment was more in terms of a rapid understanding of what is going on across the streets of London. Yes, I think it would help in terms of having a lead agency for this, but there are so many actors in place and so many agencies have their own specific part to this that what we can't do is kind of take everybody's skin out of the game. So everybody has to remain with their duty. And if we look at the way the Civil Contingencies Act is constructed, it is deliberately designed around those key agencies delivering their duties both for business continuity, emergency planning and warning, informing the public against a whole range of emergencies, which also includes surface water flooding.
Thank you. Patricia.
I think it would help. It would help to have a body having a strategic overview of surface water, but then we need to think about how what are the duties of lead local authorities, which are to kind of investigate and to try to reduce flood risk by providing or implementing sustainable drainage or other measures on the ground, versus the duty of local authorities as contingency planning authorities, which are in two different separate acts, and we don't have that linkages. So it would help, but we need to separate different functions in a way to understand what do you want to achieve from that strategic body, what do you want to achieve, a response to the flood risk, or do you want a coordination of measures to reduce flood risk? So it would help all of us, so we don't work in isolation. but we need to first understand what is the need, what do you want to achieve with that strategic body, and also accordingly change legislation, because the Flood and Water Management Act designated unitary authorities within London as those in charge of surface water flood risks. So.
Thank you. Victoria.
Yeah, thanks. I think it would be helpful to have a lead agency. I'm not sure what's meant by a new body. I think we'd want to be careful that we don't add another actor into the system that's already quite complicated. I also think there's a recognition that probably everybody on this panel has particular statutory responsibilities for certain things. So I think that lead agency coordination role would be important to at least give us a perspective on what a pan-London strategy for surface water flooding would be in the first instance.
Thank you. David?
I would agree with my colleagues. I think if there was a single lead agency, they need to have a clear understanding of partners' statutory responsibilities, also their response capability and their limitations. So for us as an example, flood is just one incident type that we are duty bound to respond to. So, I wouldn't want people to overestimate, for example, my own organisation's capabilities during a large-scale event, because we may have conflicting priorities.
And Charlie?
I suppose without repeating what's already been said, we all have our statutory responsibilities, and we do have a strategic overview for all sources of flooding. How far we can lean in and support that is limited by the resources and money that we receive from government. So it's what we can do, and what I am doing is co-chairing this task and finish group to allow us to understand, be clear about what that landscape looks like, and are there any specific gaps, and how can we coordinate better together to, have a better strategic plan. And one of the sort of areas of work that we're looking at within that task and finish group is a suggestion from the London Climate Change Partnership at looking at an adaptive plan, far forward into the future to understand what that risk is and how we manage it and what risk is acceptable collectively as all of our partners working together.
Thank you. And Lily?
Yeah, thank you. I think the issue about different partners having different legal responsibilities is quite important here, because if a safety incident, for example, happens as a result of flooding, it's our responsibility, regardless if there's an overarching body that's the strategic lead on this. But nevertheless, within that, the work that Charlie mentioned around the task and finish group, I think is a massive first step in terms of that collaboration that you're talking about. And that clearly is needed. And there clearly is a need out of the recent flooding to put more obligation on all of us, really, to share data and to make it easier to work together. So there are some practical measures that can be put in place, such as creating common platforms for sharing data and in the response to incidents, making forecasting information more translatable and easy to understand. And I'm wondering if having a convening body helps drive that forward, that's helpful, but it's as much about having a joint obligation across all of these organisations to work collaboratively and to achieve these outcomes that might as well get to the end product that you're looking for.
Thank you. And last but not least, Alex.
Thank you. I think I've already said in the meeting that I believe we do need to have a central London surface water flood risk management strategy. That strategy needs to look at how we prevent, prepare and respond to flooding. It needs to bring all those partners with all their capabilities and responsibilities to the table. And I think importantly, it needs to determine what is an acceptable level of risk. Because for many other forms of flooding, we've got determination of that, but for surface water flooding, that is still missing. I think that, until we have that, it's going to be difficult to plan.
But is part of that strategy, does that include a single authority?
I don't think we need a single authority to convene it. I think that the players know what they need to do. They need to know. It just needs someone to convene it, and I don't think that needs any new single authority to do it. It just needs someone to stand up and lead it.
Thank you. And my final question, if I can direct to Patricia and to John, can you think of any other legislative changes that could be made to improve the emergency response to flooding? Patricia, if you'd like to start.
I'm not an expert on the emergency response, I'm afraid. So my role doesn't involve responding to the emergency. But I would say, and again, I'm not aware of the legislation apart from the Contingency Act, but I would say the collaboration between different parties, as we've been talking about it all morning, is key. I don't know if anyone around the table has more information on legislation, but
well, it's more about, do we need other legislation in your opinion, rather than what's available at the moment?
I would say we need other legislation in not in response maybe, but in, for example, standards of resilience, and how do we want our infrastructure to cope, which is quite clear for planning, in planning legislation, but it's not in the rest of the legislation, and therefore not all the parties need to adhere to them.
Thank you. And John?
I'm not sure that further legislation will help us much in this. I'm no expert on the Flood and Water Management Act, I think, is it 20?
Yes, that's right.
I know the name. In terms of the Civil Contingencies Act, that is up for review at the moment, so they're looking at whether or not there is further legislation required. But I think that the duties are quite clear on what agencies need to do. I think it goes back to the previous question around how there is a driving force behind the collaboration to make it happen. And I think you've mentioned, touching on funding later, obviously to enact a legislation and to fulfil your duties under it, you need the relevant funding to do so.
Victoria, did you want to add to that?
No, I guess I was just
Sorry,
thinking...
Charlie. Apologies. Charlie.
Sorry, did you? Oh, I can say. I guess I was wondering whether there was a broader perspective that could be taken around legislation. So obviously at the beginning the chair mentioned, more front gardens are getting paved. So actually, is it about flood and water legislation or resilience legislation, or is it wider legislation, so like planning policy, etc., that may need to change in response to climate adaptation? Is probably a question I might put back if I'm able to.
And so I was just going to come in and say, I don't think there is different legislation. I think that there's a choice being made at the moment about what's being prioritised and the resources. So the roles and responsibilities, I think, are clearly laid out. It's just whether all the different players are able to prioritise the resource to this issue. And have the right skills in place. So, we're seeing quite high vacancies within our organisation, and I know others are as a result of the pandemic, etc. And then coming on to Vicky's point about development, actually, the London Plan and the Environment Strategy have very good and very strong policies around flood risk, whether it's, for this in paving SUDs or around the Thames Estuary 2100 plan longer term. But it's whether it's actually being delivered on the ground. So we've had a recent report that we're trying to interrogate in a bit more detail for London around development that goes against the Environment Agency's advice. So there's something that I want to pick up with the GLA in understanding how many of those the mayor's called in, and also, just getting a bit into more of the detail of, those actual planning applications and have they met what was set out in the London plan. So I do think that development point is really important.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Very much. As a previous leader of a council, I can say that collaborative working with different agencies will always bring the best results. Now, colleagues, we're going to have to pick up speed here a bit. We're now talking about communicating with Londoners and questions from Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just focus this question to the London Fire Brigade and London Resilience, if that's okay. How do you support London's communities to prepare for the risk of localised flooding?
So, by sharing information on our social media platforms, responding to an area after a flood event, giving advice and signposting the community to agreed sources of information so that we are giving a consistent and accurate message, and providing safety advice, an example being the use of pumps that people may hire to pump out basements, etc., and the implications of using pumps and exhaust systems in buildings, and potential contamination of flood water. So that's the advice that we've been giving.
Thanks. We work with all agencies who have the duty to warn and inform the public how they can better prepared. It comes under a kind of banner of community resilience. We've recently received pilot funding from now the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities in terms of pilot projects within LRFs to improve certain aspects. And one of the functions that we're going to put forward through that funding is a community resilience coordinator. We're trying to reach 9 million or so people, which is extremely difficult on a wide range of topics all of the time. So we have a number of kind of opportunities. We have National Flood Week coming up. We use September in terms of a 30 Days, 30 Ways campaign. And we also help signpost from our London Prepared web pages, but also every agency will have its own advice on the specific nature of emergencies that they're the lead
I'm glad
for.
you mentioned the Flood Awareness Week. Is that the correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Flood Awareness Week is about raising awareness and making sure that Londoners are prepared for flooding. Do you think that people who are at risk of flooding are actually aware of the fact that they're at risk of flooding, and how are you going to improve on that awareness?
So if I go first, and then I'll probably hand over to Charlie, who's probably a lot closer to that. I think all the tools are there for people to be aware of the flood risks that are out there. So there's the postcode lookup, there is the flood alert systems, the weather warning systems, etc., etc. The hard bit that we kind of touched on earlier, I think it was Alex who made the point of people's personal memory and whether or not they think kind of flooding won't ever strike twice, as opposed to lightning, and just how vulnerable they actually are in terms of flooding. But I don't know if Charlie, if you want.
I mean, it's a particular issue that we have all the way across the country. Even if people live right next to a river and live on flood lane, do not think they are at risk of flooding. And it's a big thing that we try to tackle every year with this flood awareness campaign. But we also go out to communities and talk to them. However, in London, it's slightly different because it's, as we've all described it, it's not quite as straightforward. Understanding that you're at risk and knowing exactly where that's going to happen. Also, London, and as I've mentioned previously in other committees, that it's a transient population. English isn't always the first language. You've got a lot of other issues going on, and because of the frequency of flooding, you just don't think it's ever going to happen to you. So I wonder whether actually the action that we should take is making sure that when it, obviously trying to make sure that we give people as much warning as possible where we can, but when you do get flooding or you can see it happening, that the information available to you, specifically on social media, etc., is good and helpful. Because standard flood advice that we would use across the rest of the country doesn't necessarily mean a huge amount when you're in a city like London.
So I'm wondering whether the London Fire Brigade can assist in this, because I know that you do excellent work when it comes to fire safety outreach. You're working with businesses and schools, you're providing some excellent information there. But what about flooding? Because in the planned framework for the Community Risk Management Plan, I gave some feedback about that. And I said it would be really good to see flooding outreach work from the London Fire Brigade. Do you think that's something you can expand on, perhaps?
Yes, well, first, thanks for providing some feedback to our CRMP. Yes, and our community safety team They do provide. We're heavily engaged in the in Flood Week and other water sort of based initiatives. I think there's more we can do. I think there's a different mindset for people living in the city than perhaps people who live in a rural environment. We still have people who may drive an SUV who think they can drive through underwater or through water, and those, despite the signs and everything else. And we just have to keep on. We just have to keep on pushing that message, and use examples as we do. We often share examples on our social media platforms to remind people, particularly people driving through floodwater, because that turns into a risk critical incident for us, and it's happening every single time we get a flood event.
Are you specifically going to be now working with, like, for example, a school? Will you be going into schools and talking to them about flood risks? Will you be doing that?
So we have a general water safety programme already in schools. So that includes flood as well as activities in and around water. So with regards to the flood responding to schools, I think we'll interrogate what information we get back from the CRMP and see what more we need to do based on the information we get from that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And can I say to colleagues and anybody watching, if you follow the London Fire Brigade, when you see public information, please do retweet. I do whenever I see it, because it's getting messages out to different communities, which is very helpful. Next question from Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you. John, what processes are there to communicate London flood warnings to Londoners?
So the flood warnings come direct from the Environment Agency. So where we see them, we will retweet if it's a kind of timely and applicable. But I think Charlie's probably better placed to answer.
Yeah. So we have a system where every phone number is opted in. So that's with landlines, mobile phones, providers. Some of them are in, some of them are out. So we're just working with each of those to opt people in, but that is place-based, associated with where they live and whether they receive that. You can then choose to opt out. So you'll receive those flood warnings. So they're for the main like quick responding catchments, and those are at risk of flooding from the sea and coming from the tides. There is some new advances in flood warnings, so there's something coming from the Cabinet Office which would push information to your phone in a certain area. It's called cell broadcasting. Whether that is effective and works within London is something that we need to work through and understand. At the moment they're looking at trialling it for severe flood warnings, which are very rare in London. And we don't often use that because of the nature of the flood risk that we've sort of discussed. And then from surface water point of view, we don't issue flood warnings. That comes through, the more social media and through from the weather warnings themselves. So hopefully
that's pretty comprehensive. It does feel like there's a gap here, and I spoke to the Mayor about this, that particularly if we're using the government's warning systems with text messages, those are only accessible to 4G and 5G phones. So we've got a whole load of people who might be living in digital poverty or just don't have a phone for whatever reason that might be getting missed. Do you think there's ways we could be more effective?
So for our standard warnings, they would come to a landline as well, just to cover that one off. But yes, I mean, it is difficult to reach those people that aren't on, social media and those more advanced phones, because that's I suppose it's going back to John's point, how quickly all of that happens, and also that we can't be everywhere at once. So in other flood areas, we would send staff out, and they will, with the fire brigade, go and or the police go and knock on the doors and make sure that they understand that risk is coming. But in London, that's very different because of the fast nature of it and the number of people we have to warn.
Do you think there's work to do in real-time monitoring of things? So, for instance, in the way we measure air pollution with these air gauges, could there be a rain gauge or even measuring the drainage themselves, their capacity at any one time?
So with the rivers, we do have live river warnings. So if you live near a river, you can now go on gov.uk and literally monitor that river level, and a lot of people who do have access to that and do live near a river know what that threshold means is when it reaches that level, it's going to come up in their garden, etc. However, again, in London it is slightly more complicated. And I don't know, Alex, in Thames Water, whether you have anything that might be of help in that situation. However, you said that things were okay in monitoring that. You didn't necessarily see the impacts.
Just thank you for that. I just actually asked the chair if I could come in on this point. So perfect segue. Thank you, Charlie. Yeah, we do have monitors both on our pumping stations and what are called sewer depth monitors. And we also have monitors which measure the discharge out of the sewers into the Thames when we have these high volume rainfall events. So we do have a monitoring system, and we are extensively increasing that by putting more sewer depth monitors in and connecting them up into one large network. So we end up with a smarter network profile, so we can actually see how water is processing through the network to give us that view. It's going to take us a couple of years to get that, installed and tested and working well, but we certainly believe that will help provide some of that insight. So we can then link it to, here is the rain we expect to be falling, here is where we expect it to be going. Are we seeing a difference? And where are we? And then linking that to the social media monitoring that we also now do to say, are we receiving distress calls from people? And then send someone out to go check it out to say, are those social media messages valid? Are we seeing flooding in an area? And is there a difference between that and what our system is telling us? So I think we're incrementally getting there. But at the end of the day, still being able to reach Londoners in the specific areas is going to be a real challenge.
Thanks, Alex. That's really helpful. This isn't the most glamorous question I've ever asked, but on sewer depth monitors, would you be able to share that information? Is that something you'd be willing to share with the committee publicly, or even just with the committee?
I can certainly go and check. It's probably very large and a very dull file, but I will check that out and get back to you.
We'd love nothing more than very dull files. Thank you. Just on the final... Oh, sorry, John.
Sorry, I just wanted to come back to the earlier point about alerting people. So the emergency alert system that you talked about is new. So it has been in development. It has been kind of banded around for a number of years. So I remember working on it in 2008, 2013, and various different projects, and kind of dismissed for various reasons of technological applicability, and also how the public will respond to it and what they do. I cannot foresee for 1 second that an emergency alert will be made on that system that does not hit virally on all of the news channels almost instantaneously, because of the nature at which the kind of threshold is set, that it's such a severe life to threat, or threat to life, sorry. And that immediate action would need to be taken. So there are only a few circumstances in which it would be applicable and would be used and could be put across in a timely fashion. But in terms of its amplification, I think every news media channel will pick up on it extremely quickly and start pushing it out through every single means.
Okay, and then my final question, John. It's not something we've spoken about much in this committee meeting, but particularly around disabled people and people who are vulnerable for whatever reason in care homes, for instance. We saw in Germany there was horrific instances of people being trapped and all sorts of things. What kind of work is being done from a resilience point of view to particularly protect those people and making sure they've got accessibility ways of getting out or help if a warning system does happen?
So again, it comes back to that very local position. So we take a pan-London view, so we cannot go into that granularity across the piece. So that comes down to the business continuity, the more local you go, the greater granularity, the greater understanding you have over all of those vulnerable people. And that would be a circumstance where, rather than this kind of wide area, ubiquitous kind of responding in a piecemeal fashion to kind of reports of water into somebody's property, where there was actually a large focused effort that needed coordinated partnership action, that's where our coordination would most likely step in. So that is some of the purpose of our calls, is to identify things that might just be sitting below the radar, or an agency just struggling to cope with, that they have all of those partners on the call that we can instigate kind of wider support to them at the time of need.
You can just check in with Patricia or Victoria if you know of any work being done locally in that granularity.
what I would assume is that we know as local authorities where our care homes, for example, are, or where specific groups of more vulnerable people are. But we wouldn't necessarily know each individual property, private property, where there would be an issue. So yeah, I don't know if my colleagues from contingency planning, they might be doing something on that. I don't know, maybe Victoria knows about the multi-agency flood plans, if there is something covered on vulnerability.
So I would expect, and I say speaking on behalf of Hounslow, so we know who our vulnerable residents are, we know where they're located in the borough, predominantly for not just about flooding, but if there were a power outage, etc., etc. So I think that information is known. It's a very good question about whether we know it to such detail, if we could apply it to different incidences. I suspect we do, but I think it's a question I'll take back to the Surface Water Task and Finish Group and to my colleagues across London.
That'd be great, because I think there's a real gap here of some very vulnerable people that we need to protect. Sorry, did you want to say something, Chair? Oh, sorry. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Mindful of the time, if you would, Assembly Member Clark, and we've got another question.
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
This question was for all, but I think in the interest of time, I'll just ask you, David, because the fire brigade is often sort of leading the way, supporting residents during an actual flooding incident. But I'm wondering, how effective are the processes that are in place to communicate with the public during a flooding incident?
Well, as well as all of the platforms that have been discussed, it's quite routine for us to actually go around and do the door knocking. In an area wider than the specific incidents, we are triaging calls now, so to target the known life risk and the vulnerable people, so the residential care homes. But we'll also have the resources to do the wider kind of door knocking and local communication.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's so important. Thank you. And John, how is London Resilient supporting responders to promote and strengthen community and personal resilience?
So as I said earlier, we have a website hosted on the GLA website, London Prepared, where we provide advice to individuals, businesses, and have synopsis of all of the major incident plans that we have on there. The duty sits with all of the individual responders as well, in terms of them warning and informing the public of what their specific risks and where they are the lead for. I also mentioned the DLUC funding for LRF pilot schemes, and we are looking at a community resilience coordinator to create some improved outreach and kind of create a bridging type mechanism between the voluntary sector and those local organisations that have a really good reach and have a trusted voice, which is really important in getting these messages across, and the resilience world. But we're also looking at running some specific work around how do we translate our risk information into a much more publicly understandable and something that would relate to the public in a lot more. So we produce our risk registers for us as practitioners and professionals. They don't necessarily speak to the public. So how can we alter that and speak to the public much better?
Thank you for that. And just a question to everyone, really. What international cities have you met with to discuss best practice on flooding? And what, if anything, have you brought back and implemented in London? Anything? Yeah, David?
Well, I'll start off. So in our planning for our own national resilience flood capability, we work very closely with the Dutch in developing our high capacity pumping capability. They're far more advanced than we were, and obviously face significant risk. So that's a good example of our international collaboration.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
And I was going to use the same example, actually. We have the same relationship from a pumping point of view. But we do have relationships across the world, which we do use to try and understand, those risks better. And I think probably more from a climate change and adaptation point of view, looking forward as well. Yes, so we do absolutely do that and bring that learning back.
Thank you. Okay, that's great. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much for your brevity on that. And we are And our final section now only has 2 quick questions, and it's about the funding and future responses to flood risk. First quick question from Assembly Member Plansky.
Thank you, Chair. Patricia, is there adequate funding to respond, recover and prevent surface water flooding? And where are the gaps?
I can respond from the LLFA point of view. Currently, how we get the funding is that the central government allocates us a specific amount of funding, but it's not ring-fenced. So it goes directly into our council funding. And I think since the last 2 years, we haven't even got the amount specified for flood risks. So how it works internally is that my director would have to bid internally for some funding from flooding. So we wouldn't get the allocated amount. First, we don't know what the allocated amount is per LLFA, and second, we have to bid internally for it. So it's not allocated for flooding as it reaches the local authority, which I don't think is good enough, to be honest.
Thank you. Victoria, it's sort of the same question, but what extra support do the LFA need and how do they access funding?
So obviously, Patricia's outlined that each local authority will get a specific grant. Hounslow gets its proportion of that. I think there are some other areas where I think funding needs to be looked at. I think we've talked about it today, about that evidence base. I think there's something about how we're able to maintain existing assets and then thinking forward into the future, that need around infrastructure, climate adaptation and resilience, and just in general, local authorities having the ability to deliver against all of their climate emergency action plans. And there's been quite a lot of work that's been done across London and with some of the core cities actually to try and put a financial figure to some of that climate investment required. And I think for London and the 12 core cities, it's something like 206 billion for climate as a whole. And so, yeah, funding is definitely required. But, there are many solutions to that I think we need to look at. And the publication, I guess, of the UK Net Zero Strategy by Government, which I'm currently working my way through, all 368 pages. Will be interesting to see to what extent flooding, climate adaptation and resilience is covered in that and what expectations we might be able to see in the future around funding.
Keep your expectations too high in terms of this
I may well be, I'm not at the final end.
And I would make the argument as well, which I'm sure you'd agree with, that money is an investment and actually that can create green jobs and all of those sorts of things. But in the interest of time, Charlie, finally, how can agencies work better together to access government funding? And also, what can the Mayor do to support this?
So the Thames Regional Flood and Coast Committee has oversight of the spending of flood risk money within the Thames catchment. And it comes from a number of sources, grant and aid funding, and then it brings in levy funding from each of the local authorities within that catchment. There's a number of things. So the Thames Regional Flood and Coastal Committee for a long time has identified that surface water funding for schemes is not as much as it should be, and that the risk, as we've discussed, is high. So it's done a number of things to try and help bring forward those schemes, which are quite hard to justify on a cost-benefit analysis. So they've run a number of pilots, etc. We've also changed a banding within it, which has allowed more surface water schemes to come forward. So we've got double the number of surface water schemes coming forward in the next 6-year programme than we had in the previous 6-year programme. But I think that that's for like new schemes or improvements to existing assets. However, maintenance is separate to that, and that's funded directly to boroughs or other authorities. So it is slightly more complicated and could be clarified. Also, understanding data, coming back to that, understanding who was flooded and the costs avoided is something that's really important, that we can all work together to provide and encourage individuals to share with us when they have been flooded. So there's quite a lot in there to unpack, and something that is an area on that task and finish group that I'm chairing that we definitely need to understand that better. We need to feed that back into government and identify where those gaps are so that we're all clear on that and how we can work together to bring forward more schemes.
Lily would like to come in, and can I ask everybody to keep their answers as brief as possible because of the time?
So just before I bring in Lily, just to say with 200,000 homes and businesses at risk and lots of Londoners without content insurance, it sounds like it's definitely worth the investment.
Yeah.
Lily.
Yeah, thank you. I think to bring to life some of those issues with relation to the transport network, we really need better data on the impact of incidents when they happen. So that's partly on us and partly on working again with that collaborative group so that we understand exactly what the impacts are, because otherwise we'll fail quite often even internally to make the business case, let alone with government. And I think the point that Charlie makes around the type of schemes is really important, because the type of work that we need to reduce the systemic threat of surface water flooding to the road and public transport networks is often a huge diverse set of smaller level interventions, which often don't really make the grade or attract attention in terms of funding, but we have to recognise that that's actually what's needed for a complex city. And finally, I think an important point is in the bigger discussions around climate change and how we move forward, so much of the emphasis rightly focuses on mitigation, but almost all the money focuses on mitigation as well, on what is often the shiny investment sides, whether it's new electric buses or other things. And actually we risk ending up with a lot of stranded assets unless we balance our investment much more clearly across adaptation and resilience and mitigation. So there's a broader strategic investment case here that we need to work through.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And the last question from Assembly Member Sahota.
Thank you, Chair. It's just a follow-up. I think the other Assembly members asked most of the questions already, but it's just a follow-up to you, John. The London Strategic Sustainable Drainage System pilot study showed that £20 million investment in delivery of nature-based SUDS interventions annually in London would reduce properties at risk by 1%. A £20 million per year investment, a £20 million contribution from the government would unlock £280 million of benefits each year and deliver 700 green jobs. Have you been making this case to the government for this sort of funding to be given to London?
So that's not my role. I don't have a responsibility per se directly for flooding. That would have to be either the lead local flood authority or the Environment Agency.
Okay, to anyone then.
So absolutely, we make we talk often with government around the need to there are several sources of funding as I identified, and partnership funding is like an additional source, and that calculator of how you receive the funding and therefore move forward the scheme doesn't necessarily work for these smaller interventions, as Lily pointed out. And what some of those pilots are looking at is a catchment level. We're feeding back that information into government to say, should there be changes to that calculator so that we can bring forward those schemes. Where we're in a lucky position within the Thames Regional Flood and Coastal Committee, because it's such a big catchment, we have some money to play with that's allowed them to try these innovative solutions to prove a point to allow that to help. So yes, we are constantly talking with government that we need to make these changes. However, as Lily pointed out, a lot of the infrastructure that's there is owned and maintained by others and can be adapted and made more resilient by those infrastructure providers, and that should happen as well at the same time, rather than the need for that to come forward from funding from government.
Okay, thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much. Well, I'm sure my colleagues have found this as interesting as I have. Thank you very much, and I'm sure the public wouldn't realise just how many people are involved in this. So can I thank all of our guests today for your contributions. Thank you very much. Can we note the report, colleagues, and today's discussion? Can we delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output from this discussion?
Agreed.
Thank you. Can we note the committee work programme and informal activity undertaken since our last meeting, namely the informal meeting with the London Fire Brigade in regards to the development of the community risk management plan?
Noted.
Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for Tuesday the 30th of November at 10 a.m. in the Chamber, City Hall. I have no other business, so I declare the meeting closed.